Welcome to the deep dive. Forget the headlines today. We're going right to the heart of something really fundamental. What does it actually mean to know something?
Yeah, it's a big one.
We've got some fascinating intellectual firepower lined up to help us unpack this.
That's right. We're looking at two really thought-provoking pieces. First, a chapter from a University of Pretoria dissertation on research design. Sounds dry, maybe, but it lays a surprisingly insightful groundwork for understanding knowledge itself.
Research design leading to philosophy of knowledge, interesting connection, and our second source.
Our second is a philosophy dissertation from McMaster University, and this one dives, really deep into the idea of epistemic contextualism.
Epistemic contextualism.
Okay, basically it explores how the meaning and even the truth of the word know might actually shift depending on the situation.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all definition. Got it.
Yeah.
Now, if you're like our typical listener, someone who's curious, wants to get a solid handle on complex ideas without getting totally bogged down, you're the perfect place.
Definitely.
We're going to try and distill the key insights from these, academic powerhouses and hopefully have a few of those satisfying aha moments along the way.
That's the plan.
Okay, so let's jump in. According to that University of Pretoria source, at its most basic, what is knowledge?
Well, the source starts with a pretty classic idea. Knowledge as true belief.
True belief, okay.
Essentially, you can only know something if, one, you believe it, and two, if that belief happens to be true. Seems like a solid foundation, right? A foundational concept.
Right, but just believing something that happens to be true isn't quite enough, is it? Like, if I blindly pick a lottery number and it wins, I wouldn't really say I knew it would win beforehand.
Precisely. That's the hitch. And that's where the University of Pretoria source starts to explore different ways we, come to know things. This brings in Locke.
John Locke.
Yep. He said knowledge comes from seeing how our ideas connect, or maybe disagree. It's not just having the ideas in your head, but actually perceiving that relationship, that connection. He even talked about intuitive knowledge, that sort of immediate flash of certainty, and then demonstrative knowledge, where we reason step by step, like in maths, to connect ideas.
So for Locke, it's ideas plus seeing the connection. That's the key.
That's a key takeaway, yeah. Knowledge requires both the ideas and perceiving their connection.
Like knowing something's hot because you touch it, intuitive, right? And knowing triangle angles add up to 180, that's demonstrative. More logical steps involved.
Yeah.
Makes sense. What else did they pull from?
They also touched on Kant. He made a distinction between rational certainty, that kind of logical, undeniable truth, and empirical certainty, which comes purely from our senses, from experience.
Okay. Rational versus empirical.
Right. And Kant actually questioned whether empirical certainty, based on senses, truly reaches the highest bar of what we'd call knowledge. So Kant raises a really crucial question. How certain do we actually need to be to truly know something? Is pretty sure enough.
That makes you think about the difference between being really, really sure based on experience, maybe loads of evidence, and knowing something is logically impossible to be false. Like 2 + 2 = 4.
Exactly. What other perspectives did they include?
Well, Piaget's theory is fascinating. The developmental psychologist.
Oh, yeah. How does he fit in? He viewed knowledge not as a static thing, but as an active, ongoing process. We're constantly building our understanding through our interactions with the world.
So not just soaking it up like a sponge.
Not at all. We're constructing and refining our mental models all the time. The core insight there is knowledge is something we actively build, not just passively receive.
Like a scientist constantly experimenting, tweaking their theories based on new data.
Okay.
And in a more practical sense. Did they talk about that?
Yeah, the source also mentions knowledge work.
Knowledge work.
Defined basically as tackling problems that don't have a straightforward routine solution. Non-routine problem solving. This highlights that knowledge isn't just abstract theory. It's about applying what we understand to solve new and complex challenges. It's knowledge in action.
So we've gone from foundational definitions like true belief to how we build understanding, like Piaget, and then how we use it in the real-world knowledge work. But you mentioned a challenge to this true belief idea earlier, something about Gettier.
Yes, exactly. And it's a big one in philosophy. The source briefly brings up the Gettier problem.
Right.
These are classic thought experiments, really clever ones, that show how you can have a belief that is true, and you can even have, good reasons for believing it.
Okay.
But intuitively, it just doesn't feel like genuine knowledge. There's a sort of luck involved.
Ah, right, that classic scenario where someone gets lucky with a guess based on what turns out to be false information, but they end up being right anyway.
Exactly. It's just a coincidence, not real knowing. So the key insight from Gettier is justified true belief isn't always enough for knowledge. There's often some missing element, something more needed.
Wow. Okay, so the simple question of what is knowledge is already pretty complicated, which I guess leads us perfectly to our second source and this whole idea of context.
Epistemic contextualism.
So what's the core of this epistemic contextualism from the McMaster source?
The fundamental idea really is that the meaning and, crucially, the truth of the word know aren't fixed. They're not set in stone.
Okay.
Instead, they change depending on the context, the situation in which we use the word know.
Like how tall means something different for a basketball player versus a jockey.
That's a great analogy. Or think about how we use the word rich. What counts as rich for, say, a student is very different from what counts as rich for a CEO.
Totally different scale.
Exactly. Contextualists argue that something similar happens with know. The key takeaway is the standards for knowledge can shift depending on the situation.
So depending on the circumstances, the bar for what counts as knowing something can go up or down. Higher stakes, higher bar.
Exactly. The source discusses the binary contextualist view. People like Cohen, DeRose, Lewis are the big names here.
Okay.
They say that knowledge is basically a relationship between a person and a fact, like, I know the capital of France is Paris. Simple enough.
Right.
But whether that statement is true depends on things in the context, like how important is it to be right in this specific situation, or what alternative possibilities are actually relevant right now.
High stakes, more scrutiny, basically. Can you give me an example?
Sure. The source mentions Cohen's airport case. It's a good one. Imagine you're at the airport chilling and you casually say, yeah, I know my flight leaves at 3 p.m. You checked the board earlier, seemed fine, low stakes.
Okay, standard situation.
But now, imagine you absolutely must catch this flight. Like, a life-changing opportunity depends on it. Suddenly, the possibility of a last-minute gate change or a delay, those become much more relevant, right? Much more concerning.
Yeah, you'd probably want to double-check, triple-check.
Exactly. And Cohen argues that in this high-stakes context, you might hesitate to say, I know my flight leaves at 3 p.m., even though your actual evidence seeing it on the board earlier hasn't changed. The context, the stakes, have raised the bar for what counts as knowing in that moment. So, takeaway. Higher stakes can increase the standards for knowledge description.
I see. It's like the more that rides on being correct, the more certain we feel we need to be to actually claim knowledge.
Yeah.
What about DeRose's bank cases? Similar idea.
Very similar. DeRose presents these scenarios involving a trip to the bank. In a normal, low-stakes situation, you might say you know the bank will be open on Saturday, because it usually is. You've been there on Saturdays before.
Makes sense.
But if you absolutely need to deposit a check on Saturday to avoid, say, a huge financial penalty, you might suddenly feel you don't really know unless you've called them or checked their website very recently.
Right. The usual isn't good enough anymore.
Precisely. Again, the higher the potential negative consequences of being wrong, the stricter our standards for knowledge seem to become.
Interesting how our gut feeling about whether we really know something seems so sensitive to the circumstances. Now, the source also mentions something called contrastivism. How's that different?
Yeah, contrastivism, championed mainly by Jonathan Schaeffer, offers a slightly different angle on how context matters.
Okay.
Instead of saying know is a two-part relationship, knower and fact that just gets influenced by context.
Like I know P.
Right. Schaeffer says know is actually inherently a three-part relationship. Knower, fact, and what that fact is being contrasted with, a contrast proposition.
3 parts. So not just Sarah knows John is in the kitchen,
but rather, Sarah knows John is in the kitchen rather than, say, in the living room, or rather than outside.
Ah, okay. So there's always an implied instead of what?
Exactly. The core idea is knowledge is always about ruling out specific alternatives. The truth of I know the light is on depends on whether I have enough evidence to rule out the relevant contrast, maybe the light being off, or maybe it flickering, depending on the conversation.
So the contrast kind of sharpens the focus of the knowledge claim. Makes it more precise.
That's a good way to put it. It focuses the lens on what we're sure about compared to specific other possibilities.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about David Lewis and this idea of conversational score? Sounds like keeping track in a game.
Huh. Yeah, it kind of does. Lewis argued that when we claim to know something in a conversation, there are these unspoken rules operating. Rules about what possibilities we need to consider seriously and which ones we can, safely ignore for the purpose of the chat.
Unspoken rules.
Okay.
He talks about permissive rules, things we can ignore, like really outlandish possibilities, and prohibitive rules, things we can't ignore, usually because they've been raised as relevant. These shape the context. So, key insight. Conversations have these background rules that influence what counts as knowing in that specific exchange.
Permissive rules, things we can get away with not worrying about. Prohibitive rules, things we absolutely have to take into account if they come up. Can you give me an example of how these might work together? Sure. Imagine a casual chat about whether the local shop is open. Permissive rules might let us just ignore the, incredibly remote possibility that the entire town has been secretly evacuated overnight by aliens.
Right. We don't usually need to rule that out.
We just don't. But if someone in the conversation then says, wait, didn't I hear they changed their Sunday hours recently? Boom. That raises a relevant, not outlandish possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And according to the prohibitive rules, we probably can't just ignore that possibility anymore. If we want to keep claiming we know the shop is open, we might need to check.
So the flow of the conversation itself can bring certain possibilities into focus, making them relevant to whether we can truly claim to know something right then and there.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the case for context mattering. But the source then shifts to arguments against this idea of contextualism, right? Challenges.
Yes, exactly. And there are some significant ones. One of the main arguments has to do with how we use language, specifically adjectives.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about an adjective like tall or flat. We can say someone is very tall or slightly tall, or a surface is perfectly flat or mostly flat. These words are gradable. They come in degrees.
Right, makes sense.
But it sounds really weird, doesn't it, to say, John very knows the answer, or I slightly know what you mean?
Yeah, that sounds completely wrong. You either know or you don't, usually.
Exactly. The fact that know doesn't seem to work like other context-sensitive, gradable words suggests to critics that maybe it isn't context-sensitive in the same way. Maybe the meaning is more fixed.
That's a really interesting linguistic point. We understand degrees of tallness, but degrees of knowing just sounds off.
Yeah.
What else pushes back against contextualism?
Well, there's also experimental philosophy, or XPhi.
XPhi, what's that?
It's basically philosophers doing empirical research like surveys or experiments to see what ordinary people's intuitions actually are about philosophical concepts.
Oh, cool. So testing the theories against how people actually think.
Kind of, yeah. And some studies have looked at whether people's intuitions about knowledge actually change in different scenarios with varying stakes, the way contextualism predicts they should.
And what did they find?
Well, some findings mentioned in the source suggest that while our confidence in our beliefs might definitely change with the stakes, like in the bank case, you feel less confident if the stakes are high.
Right.
Our judgment of whether we actually know something might be more stable than contextualists thought. People might still say they know, even in the high-stakes case, even if they feel less sure.
Huh. So the pressure might make us feel less certain, make us want to double check, but that doesn't necessarily mean the underlying truth of whether we knew it all along has changed for us.
That's the implication some researchers draw, yeah. It suggests our intuitions about knowing might not be quite as context-dependent as some philosophers have argued. It challenges the core data contextualists often rely on those gut feelings in the thought experiments.
Interesting. So empirical data adds another layer of complexity. What other challenges does the McMaster source highlight?
It brings up this issue called indirect concessions.
Indirect concessions.
This is about how we react when confronted with skepticism. So in everyday life, we might be perfectly happy to say, I know I have hands, right?
Yeah.
Seems obvious.
Sure.
But if someone, maybe a philosopher, brings up a far-fetched skeptical scenario like, but how do you know you're not a brain in a vat just being fed the sensation of having hands? We might suddenly become less certain.
Yeah, those scenarios mess with your head.
They do. And we might even concede, well, okay, maybe I don't know for sure in that absolute sense.
Right.
The challenge for contextualism here is, if our everyday standards for knowledge are really supposed to be low and easy to meet, why are we so easily swayed by these extreme, high-standard skeptical possibilities? Why do we sometimes concede ground?
You're saying it suggests our ordinary standards might actually be closer to the stricter, skeptical ones than contextualists like to admit, that we implicitly hold ourselves to a higher bar even normally.
That's the worry, yeah. It suggests that maybe the skeptical challenge has more bite is more relevant to our ordinary understanding than the contextualist picture allows.
It's like that little seed of doubt, even if it's about something really unlikely, like being a brain in a vat, can still make us pause and question our everyday knowledge claims. The source also mentions the Gettier case again in this context. How does that challenge contextualism specifically?
Well, the Gettier problem, remember, shows that justified true belief isn't always knowledge because of that element of luck.
Right.
The challenge to contextualism is that simply adjusting the standards for justification based on context, saying justified enough for this context, might not solve the fundamental Gettier problem. The issue might be deeper than just setting the right standard.
So even if we have high-stakes justification and a true belief, we could still be in a Gettier situation where it doesn't feel like knowledge.
Exactly. It points to a potential structural issue with defining knowledge itself, something that merely fiddling with the contextual standards for know might not fully fix. Gettier suggests a deeper problem that contextualism might not adequately address.
Okay, wow. So defining knowledge is tricky, context might matter, but maybe not how we thought. Now let's tackle this next big concept, knowledge and logical closure. This is the basic principle here.
Okay, the principle of closure. At its simplest, it states that if you know something, let's call it P.
Okay.
P, and you know that P logically implies or leads to another thing, let's call it Q.
P implies Q.
Got it. Then the principle says you also know Q. It seems really intuitive, almost obvious. Knowledge should follow logic, right?
Right. Seems straightforward.
Yeah.
Like if I know all mammals breathe air, P, and I know a whale is a mammal, that P implies Q for whales.
No, wait. If P is all mammals breathe air, and you know a whale is a mammal, let's call that R, then you deduce a whale breathes air, Q. So if you know P and R together imply Q, you know Q.
Oh, right. Okay. If I know all birds have feathers, P, and I know a robin is a bird, R, then it follows that I also know a robin has feathers, Q. That makes sense.
Exactly. Knowledge seems like it should be closed under known implication or competent deduction. But it gets complicated.
Of course it does.
The McMaster source delves into different versions of this principle. Some versions emphasize that you need to actually perform the deduction, or at least be able to perform it competently, to gain knowledge of Q. It's not just automatic.
So it's not just about the logical link existing out there in the abstract. You have to sort of grasp it or work through it yourself.
Precisely. You need epistemic access to the implication, some versions say. Then the source discusses Fred Dretschke's arguments against closure.
Against it? How can you argue against that?
Well, Dretschke used what he called heavyweight propositions.
Heavyweight. Sounds important, like foundational beliefs.
Exactly. These are fundamental beliefs about the world, often things we take for granted. Dretschke's famous zebra case illustrates this perfectly.
Okay, the zebra case. Lay it on me.
Imagine you're at the zoo. You see animals in an enclosure clearly labeled zebras. They look exactly like zebras. You have very good reason to believe they are zebras, so you'd say, I know those are zebras.
Yeah, sounds reasonable. I know they are zebras. P.
Okay. Now, P, those are zebras, logically implies Q. Those are not cleverly disguised mules painted to look like zebras. Because if they were cleverly disguised mules, they wouldn't be zebras.
Right, that follows logically. Zebras are not mules.
But Dretschke asks, do you actually know they aren't cleverly disguised mules just by looking? Could the zoo be pulling an elaborate prank? He argued that while you might know P, they are zebras, you don't necessarily know Q, they are not disguised mules, even though P implies Q.
Huh. So I know the first thing based on my senses and the sign, but I don't automatically know the second thing, which is ruling out this weird alternative.
That was Dretschke's point. He thought knowledge doesn't always close under known implication, especially when it comes to ruling out these skeptical, heavyweight alternatives that undermine our basic ways of knowing.
So according to Dretschke, knowledge has limits. It doesn't always neatly follow logical implications, particularly for these deep assumptions about reality not being deceptive. Wow, okay. What other perspectives on closure did this source cover?
It looked at Robert Nozick, who also questioned closure, but for slightly different reasons based on his theory of knowledge.
Nozick, right. What was his take?
Nozick had this idea that for you to know something, your belief in it has to be sensitive to the truth. Basically meaning if it were false, you wouldn't believe it.
Okay, your belief tracks the truth.
Right. And he argued that your belief that the animals are zebras might be sensitive if they were, say, elephants instead. You wouldn't believe they were zebras.
Makes sense.
But your belief that they are not cleverly disguised mules might not be sensitive. If they were cleverly disguised mules, they'd still look like zebras, so you'd probably still believe they weren't mules. You'd still believe they were zebras.
So my belief wouldn't change even if the situation was different in that specific disguised mule way.
Exactly. So because the sensitivity condition holds for P, they are zebras, but not for Q, they are not disguised mules, Nozick concludes you can know P without knowing Q, even though P implies Q. So again, closure fails.
Interesting. So even if it logically follows, our ability to reliably track the truth of that specific implication might be different, breaking the chain. And how does contextualism, the idea we talked about earlier, handle closure? Does it save it?
Well, contextualists try to save closure, but it gets pretty intricate. The source mentions Stephen Schiffer's contextualist take. Schiffer suggests that maybe closure does hold, but only relative to a consistent epistemic standard or context. So if we're in an easy context with low standards and you know P relative to easy, and P implies Q, then you know Q relative to easy.
Okay, that sounds like closure works in easy contexts.
But if knowing Q requires meeting a tough standard, like ruling out disguised mules, then even if you know P relative to the easy standard, you might not know Q relative to the tough standard. So closure seems to fail if the standards shift mid-implication. It gets complicated trying to make it work smoothly across different contexts.
Right, keeping the context consistent seems key, but maybe hard to do. What about the contrastivists? Schaeffer's view.
Contrastivism also has its own version of closure, sometimes called contract Q. It also tries to preserve closure by building the contrast into the principle itself.
Okay.
But the source notes that this view also faces potential problems, like maybe overgeneralizing in some cases or leading to seemingly contradictory contrasts in others.
So the bottom line seems to be,
the bottom line is that the closure principle, which looks so simple and obvious on the surface, is actually a really complex and hotly debated topic in epistemology, the theory of knowledge. There's no easy consensus.
okay, so this seemingly simple idea of if A implies B, and I know A, I must know B, turns out to be, well, a real can of worms.
Yeah.
Now, let's connect this back. How do contextualists try to use their theory to answer the big question that kind of haunts all of this skepticism? You know, the idea that we can't really know anything for sure.
Like the ultimate challenge. Contextualists often see their theory as offering a neat solution or maybe dissolution of the skeptical problem.
How so?
They argue that when skeptics bring up those outlandish scenarios, you know, being a brain in a vat, the matrix, the evil demon deceiving you.
Yeah, the classics.
What they're doing is effectively raising the standards for knowledge to an impossibly high level, a level where you'd need to rule out every conceivable possibility of error, no matter how remote. And contextualists say, sure, relative to those incredibly high standards, maybe we don't know much, maybe we don't know we have hands. But, they argue, those standards are completely irrelevant to our normal, everyday lives and conversations.
So the skeptical context is just a different language game with different rules.
Kind of. In our ordinary context, the standards for what counts as knowing are much lower, much more practical. And relative to those standards, we can confidently and truthfully say, we know lots of things, like, I know I have hands, I know it's raining, I know Paris is the capital of France.
So the contextualist strategy is basically, skeptical doubts impose super high standards, but those standards just don't apply in ordinary situations. We're allowed to ignore them most of the time.
That's the core idea. In a normal conversation, when I say I know it's raining because I see it and hear it, I meet the ordinary, contextually appropriate standards for knowledge. The skeptical possibility that I'm, hooked up to a super advanced weather simulation is irrelevant in this context and doesn't undermine my claim to know it's raining.
It preserves our everyday knowledge claims, while still acknowledging the logical force of the skeptical argument within its specific high-stakes context.
Exactly. That's the appeal of the contextualist response. However,
well, there's always a however.
As we discussed earlier with indirect concessions, this neat solution isn't universally accepted. The fact that we can be so easily prompted to doubt our knowledge, even in ordinary situations when faced with those skeptical scenarios.
Right. The brain in a vat thing still niggles.
It suggests that maybe the gap between our everyday understanding of knowledge and the skeptic's challenge isn't quite as wide or easily dismissed as contextualists believe. That maybe those high standards do have some pull on us, even normally.
So the challenge back to contextualism's anti-skepticism is, why are we often surprisingly vulnerable to skeptical doubts, even in everyday life? if they're truly irrelevant.
Precisely. It suggests the skeptical argument, no matter how far-fetched it seems, might still tap into something about our concept of knowledge or our psychological relationship to certainty.
The source also briefly mentions other ways philosophers respond to skepticism, right? Like Morianism and fallibilism.
Yes, just briefly. Morianism, named after G.E. Moore, basically says we should trust our fundamental common sense beliefs, like I have hands, more than we trust the premises of any abstract philosophical argument against them. It's a kind of robust common sense defense.
So I know I have hands is just more obviously true than any philosopher's argument that I might not.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And fallibilism is the view that we can have knowledge even if our justification isn't perfect, even if there's a possibility, however small or remote, that we could be wrong.
Okay, so fallibilism accepts knowledge isn't absolute certainty.
Right. Contextualism tries to find a kind of middle ground. It acknowledges the force of skeptical arguments within their specific, highly demanding context, while trying to preserve our ordinary knowledge claims as true within their more everyday contexts.
Okay, one final concept, and it connects to fallibilism. The source talks about the strangeness of saying fallible knowledge. If fallibilism is true, and maybe all our empirical knowledge is technically fallible, why does saying I fallibly know sounds so weird? It feels contradictory.
Yeah, it really does sound odd, doesn't it? That's a really insightful question the source tackles. It points mainly to a pragmatic explanation, drawing on the linguistic philosopher Paul Grice's work on conversational implicature.
Pragmatic, meaning how we use language in conversation.
Exactly. Essentially, when you say, I fallibly know P, the very act of adding the word fallibly signals something to your listener. It implies that there's a relevant, significant possibility of error that you feel the need to mention.
Okay.
But if that possibility of error is significant enough to explicitly mention, it seems to weaken or conversationally undermine your simultaneous claim to actually know P. Knowing implies a certain level of certainty or authority that mentioning fallibility seems to undercut.
So it's almost self-contradictory in a conversational sense, even if not strictly logically contradictory.
That's the Gracian idea. It's like saying, I'm pretty sure I know this, but hey, just so you know, there's a decent chance I'm completely wrong about it. The second part really clashes with the first part in terms of the message you're conveying.
Yeah, the decent chance I'm completely wrong part really undercuts the pretty sure I know this part. It makes the listener wonder why you said you know it at all.
Exactly. The source also touches on a related psychological perspective from Jennifer Nagel involving something called epistemic egocentrism.
Epistemic egocentrism.
It's the idea that our own awareness of possibilities of error, even quite remote ones, can make us hesitant to ascribe knowledge both to ourselves and to others. Once we've consciously entertained the thought that we or they could be mistaken, it becomes psychologically harder to fully endorse the strong commitment implied by the word no.
So just thinking about the possibility of being wrong makes us shy away from using the word no.
It can, yeah. Our awareness of potential error, even if small, can make us reluctant to claim knowledge, even if, from a purely philosophical standpoint, our belief might still count as justified and true. There's a psychological barrier.
So even if philosophically fallible knowledge might be a coherent concept, the way we actually use language in conversation and our own psychological wiring make it sound distinctly odd.
That seems to be the consensus, yeah.
Okay, we have truly plunged into the deep end of the pool of knowledge in this deep dive. Let's try and pull back and recap the big takeaway.
Sounds good. I think the core insight really is just how much more complex the concept of knowledge is than we often realize in daily life.
Definitely.
We started seeing that even the basic definition, like justified true belief, faces major hurdles, like the Gettier problems.
Right.
Then we explored how the context of a situation, the stakes, the conversation, the contrasts might actually change the very meaning, or at least the standards, for knowing. That was contextualism and contrastivism. Then we grappled with whether knowledge neatly follows logical rules with the whole closure debate, zebra or mule.
Yeah, the zebra case.
And we looked at different attempts to answer that persistent problem of skepticism, including the contextualist strategy. And finally, we examined why even the potentially correct idea of fallible knowledge feels so counterintuitive to say out loud.
So the big picture really is defining and understanding what it means to know something is this huge, multifaceted philosophical challenge with, frankly, no easy, universally agreed upon answers.
That sums it up pretty well.
So the real aha moment for you listening should be realizing that when someone asks, do you know? Or when you claim to know something yourself, there's this whole hidden philosophical landscape packed into that simple word.
Yeah.
It's not just a straightforward yes or no. It's loaded with assumptions about the context, what alternatives are being considered, what standard of certainty we're holding ourselves or others to.
Precisely. And for you, our learner, hopefully, this deep dive has given you a really valuable framework, some new tools for thinking more critically about the knowledge claims you encounter every single day and maybe the ones you make yourself.
Absolutely. Now, for one final thought to ponder as we wrap up, think about a time when you felt utterly, completely certain about something. Just reflect on that feeling of certainty. Now, ask yourself, what possibilities, however unlikely they seemed at the time, did you perhaps not even consider? How did the specific context of that situation, the stakes, who you were talking to, what you were trying to achieve, influence your confidence?
That's a great reflection point.
And maybe think about how understanding these different philosophical angles we've discussed today, contextualism, closure, fallibility, might change how you approach the things you think you know going forward.
Definitely some food for thought there.
It is indeed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.